I want to thank everyone for being in attendance today here at SF General. Each year across our country, we have millions of Americans that slip through the cracks of our mental health system, and countless individuals here in our own city of San Francisco. They make up a significant portion of our homeless population and also cause incredible amounts of pain and suffering for family members that have cared for them for years. We need more effective tools at the local level to help these individuals, to help their families, and Laura's Law is one of those options. Similar laws have been enacted in 44 out of 50 states across our country with great results, and it is time that San Francisco move forward. That is why today, along with 3 colleagues on the Board of Supervisors, I am introducing legislation to fully implement Laura's Law here in San Francisco. And in addition, because we know that prior attempts at City Hall have failed, I am also, with my co-sponsors, placing Laura's Law on the November 2014 ballot. If we cannot pass Laura's Law within the walls of City Hall, I believe this is an important enough issue that the voters of San Francisco should decide the outcome. I do want to share a personal story with you as well about a mother that I've come to know over the past few years here in San Francisco. A mother who cared for her only child, a son, for years, who was diagnosed early with mental illness, who was able to take his medication with family support and was stable, was in school in San Francisco and did incredibly well. But once this individual turned 18 years old, decided not to take his medication any longer. And despite the pleading from the family members, this individual started to lock himself in his room, started to exhibit violence towards his other family members and towards himself, and now moved out of the house, and the parents have no idea where he is. This heartache, this situation for family members that is repeated countless times in many different ways and forms and fashions and many different stories across our city and across our country can be avoided. San Francisco can and should do better. Parents, families, and friends should feel supported by the cities and counties that they live in, that the laws are in place to help those that can't help themselves. If Laura's Law were in place in San Francisco, the situation I just described with that family member would not have to happen. Laura's Law is the compassionate option for families and for individuals to make sure that they have a right to treatment here in our country and here locally. We all know we have a mental health crisis on our hands across our country and here locally. A recent report that was featured last week in a national publication had more than 43 million Americans suffering from mental illness and over 9 million Americans suffering from severe mental illnesses such as schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and major depression. And over 3.5 million of those individuals not getting treatment in our country. Laura's Law provides community-based assisted outpatient treatment to individuals who, as a result of their mental illness, are unable to access community health options on their own. Adopting Laura's Law here in San Francisco will help those who need it the most, but not only will it help those that need it the most, we need to be clear that not everyone will qualify for Laura's Law. There are strict guidelines and protections in place. To qualify, you have to be determined not to be able to survive on your own independently in the community that you reside in, have to have a history of hospitalizations and be having diagnosed previously with mental health problems, having been offered the opportunity to participate in treatment but have failed to engage and be substantially deteriorating here in our local community. What I would argue that our mental health system here in San Francisco is one of the finest in the country. The reality is we do have countless individuals slipping through the cracks. Laura's Law is designed to help those individuals that need our help as a community. Laura's Law focuses on vulnerable individuals, and of those 44 other jurisdictions and states across our country, they have proven incredible results. In New York State, a similar law called Kendra's Law has been enacted. For those individuals, 74% fewer experienced homelessness. 77% fewer experienced psychiatric hospitalization. 83% fewer were incarcerated, and 87% fewer were arrested. Laura's Law will also help reduce the burdens on our emergency infrastructure here in San Francisco and our emergency officers and personnel, and will also be a positive resource for our public safety officers. Today we're going to hear from a number of people that are going to speak on Laura's Law in support and on its behalf. But I want to take a moment to recognize a number of people that are here today. First of all, a few that are not here. My colleagues and co-sponsors of this legislation and this ballot initiative, Supervisor London Breed, Supervisor Katie Tang, and Supervisor Scott Wiener. I want to thank Mayor Ed Lee for his support. I want to thank the Wilcox family in particular, the parents of Laura, who this law was named after, Nick and Amanda Wilcox. I want to thank our District Attorney, Mr. George Gascon, our Chief of Police, Greg Sir, our Chief of our Fire Department, Joanna Hayes-White, and countless others and individuals that are standing behind me here today. Barbara Garcia from our Public Health Department. I want to thank Margie from the St. Vincent de Paul Society, who's one of the largest homeless housing providers here in San Francisco. People from our labor and business organizations across our town. This is a piece of legislation. This is law that should unite us all as a city to provide compassion and care. I look forward to seeing it move forward. So at this point, I'd like to introduce one of Laura's Law supporters and our great mayor of San Francisco, Mr. Edwin Lee.
Thank you, Supervisor Farrell, and thank you for your leadership on this as well. You know, San Francisco is a very compassionate city, and we exhibit that on a daily basis, if not on an annual basis. We spend $2.7 billion a year in our social safety net, a great bulk of it right here in General Hospital and our health department. And thanks to the collaboration of our fire and police, our district attorney, we pick up a lot of people on our streets. And we know that with the habits and with the environment, they go right back, perhaps a day or two of respite, and they're right back. And while we can provide some pride in having moved some 18,000 homeless people into permanent shelters over the last 2 years, we see on the streets that we have to do more. And this is exactly the issue that Supervisor Farrell is addressing, and I really want to signal my appreciation for his not only looking at this, but diving into it, having spent considerable amount of his time studying the problem and talking with so many experts to find out what else it is that we should be doing. And while I say that our past policies have been successful to a certain extent, we have to do more, and the evidence is right in front of us. In particular, when you talk with the DA, when you talk with the police and the fire department and our health department, you'll understand that there are individuals that repeatedly get picked up, and sometimes too late. Sometimes it's in death. But for the majority of time, we try to save them in their psychiatric emergencies or in their exuberance in medicating themselves. Something has got to change in the way we deliver our services. We're too compassionate of a city to not be smarter about this. And so, even with all of the work that we've done, and most recently I joined our Director of Health to initiate the CARES initiative and move it from a pilot program of 5 or 6 individuals that got 24/7 psychiatric care and medication on them to a full program where we have almost 9 additional individuals targeting families who are gotten individuals in their care that are suffering from mental health, to transitional age youth, additional specialty care experts that will focus right here in General Hospital as we create a psychiatric respite a mental shelter, if you will, for those individuals. We've initiated the CARES initiative to give more care and to ensure success and assure a successful response. But even with that, we do need some additional help. And this is where Supervisor Farrell's research and contacts have been so valuable. It is time for us to consider what we will do apart from waiting for somebody at their most extreme situations. Laura's Law can help us identify individuals before they end up in death or in their highest psychiatric help and emergency. It is that additional tool that, as oftentimes our law enforcement, but also our care specialists must have in order to get to somebody earlier. It could literally prevent many more deaths on our streets. And so I am thankful, particularly to Amanda and Nick for being here on behalf of Laura, to remember what had occurred at that case, but also the cases that Mark has suggested already have happened, and to so many others that we know there are many, many more stories that we could be telling of people that we know that are on the streets. And we also know their habit. They will get some limited respite. We will pull them off of streets. We will get the hot teams out there with Bevan Duffy's outreach and so many others. But at the same time, hundreds of individuals will repeat in going back to their self-medication and experiencing the psychiatric challenges that they have. We've got to have better answers. And so we seek Laura's Law as a tool to help us to become even more of a compassionate city. It is not about the money anymore. It is not about the housing. It really is about paying attention to something that we haven't paid attention to. And again, I want to thank all of the people here standing behind me. There'll be many others. We do hope very seriously that the supervisors of the board will find at least 6 total that will support this, if not more. But we are prepared to go to the ballot, and I will support it on the ballot if it has to go that way, so that we can assure ourselves that we're doing everything possible for the elements, for the individuals that exist in our streets that ought to have better care. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Mayor Lee. At this point, I would like to invite up Nick and Amanda Wilcox, Laura's parents, who have been incredible leaders on this issue ever since that tragic day, and someone that we all owe a huge debt of gratitude towards. Nick and Amanda Wilcox.
Thank you. Good morning. Can you hear me? So many families live with mental illness every day. My family was not one of them. I never thought about mental health treatment and mental health care until 13 years ago. I wish I had. In January 2001, my daughter Laura was murdered while home on winter break from college. She was filling in at the Nevada County Behavioral Health Department when a person with severe mental illness opened fire with a semi-automatic handgun and shot her 4 times at point-blank range. She was shot twice in the heart and died instantly. When the rampage at the clinic and a nearby restaurant ended, 3 people lay dead, 3 were severely injured. A community was shaken, and the world was diminished by the loss of an incredible young woman. Laura was bright and beautiful at age 19. In fact, I have a picture of her I'll be happy to show later. She had tremendous capability, kindness, and spirit. She was an outstanding student, graduating as high school valedictorian, and was in the midst of her campaign for student body presidency at Haverford College, where she was a sophomore. She had a tremendous future, the brightest of prospects, and she wanted to make a positive difference in the world, and she was on her way to doing that. My life, of course, was turned upside down when she was murdered. Initially, I was just in shock. My grief was profound. I always thought that my daughter would outlive me. I miss her. I still miss her every single day. Nick and I needed to somehow understand and get our mind around how we lost our daughter. How could this happen? Who did this? So we learned more about Laura's murderer. His name was Scott Thorpe. He was in his late 30s. He had severe mental illness. He was rapidly decompensating. He was a client at the clinic, but he was missing appointments. His family was trying to intervene, but they were helpless in doing so. All they could do was hope that nothing would happen. Scott Thorpe was apprehended the same day that Laura and 3 others were killed in his home. He initially was incompetent to stand trial. Eventually, he pled guilty and ultimately was found not guilty by reason of insanity and was sentenced to Napa State Hospital, where he is today. Under a penal commitment at Napa State Hospital, one receives medical treatment. There's the resources for it, and it can be forced. In some ways, Scott Thorpe received the worst punishment he could have ever received, and that is improvement in his mental health care or mental condition to the point that he now fully understands and, of course, regrets what he did. He has to live with that every single day. His mental improvement and stability and insight, of course, is too late for him. I mean, he will be forever incarcerated. And, of course, too late for Laura. To Nick and I, this just seemed totally backwards. We wait until somebody commits a horrific crime and then we get them into treatment. That did not make sense to us. We thought there had to be a better approach. Nick will tell you more about how we got involved with the legislation that ultimately ended up as Laura's Law. But we knew, and what we wanted to work for was getting treatment before someone deteriorates, before they are incapacitated by mental illness, and before they do harm to self or others. We thought it made sense to give treatment in homes and in communities rather what's happening now, waiting to give it to them in jail and in prisons. And of course, doing so not only is better for that individual, but better for individuals that are impacted by severe mental illness. So we worked to pass Laura's Law. It was implemented in Nevada County, and I'm very proud of our little county that is leading the way on this. And as you will hear, the outcomes are fabulous. They are far better than we ever envisioned. And so I think we can feel that through this tragedy, we are indeed making a positive difference in Laura's name. I wish we had her back, but I'm glad we can at least do that in her honor. So I'll turn it over to my husband, Nick.
I have a lump in my throat after that. Sorry. When Laura died, there are 2 things that we needed to find out early on. We needed to find out the facts about what happened. We eventually found out the facts. It took a long time, but we feel that we know what happened. We also needed to know why it happened, and we actually came to that understanding relatively quickly. We came to understand that Laura, in a sense, was a victim of a failing mental health system. My sister, actually my stepsister, Karen, had some experience in this area. Her biological father was a brilliant traffic engineer, the founder of the traffic engineering school at Yale. But he developed late onset paranoid schizophrenia. He threatened to kill my sister and my stepmother. Back in those days, they were able to get him into treatment, and he spent the rest of his life at Connecticut Valley State Hospital. but she had some understanding of mental health issues. So it's not true that our wider family had no experience with mental illness. So she understood. She was also very politically connected. She was heavily involved in the Clinton administration. She knew lobbyists in Sacramento. She was able to get us in touch with Assemblywoman Helen Thompson, who represented the Yolo County, Davis area. Helen was a psychiatric nurse. She was sponsoring legislation at that time called AB 1421, which was the precursor for Laura's Law. And so in the early days, we didn't know what else to do except strike back at the system. And so we became involved in Laura's Law and the legislation and watched it go through the process. There are others here who were heavily involved. Randall Hager behind me was heavily involved from the start, and I give him and Carla Jacobs and Fuller Torrey huge amounts of credit. So we watched the legislative process, and all I'll say about that is that it's said to be akin to sausage making. It's somewhat ugly. You don't really want to know what goes into it so long as the product is pleasing. Laura's Law was somewhat like sausage making. And what came out wasn't what we had hoped for, but it was definitely a step in the right direction. As we got involved in this process, we learned more about mental illness. We learned that mental illness is a biological condition, has nothing to do with moral depravity or anything like that. It is a chemical condition in the brain. We also learned that many people with severe mental illness have a condition called anosognosia, or lack of insight. These are people with severe mental illness who do not seek treatment and will not stay engaged in treatment. Laura's Law is really aimed at this population. Mayor Lee and Supervisor Farrell said a little bit about the law, but basically Laura's Law allows parents and others to contact their mental health director to seek a court order to engage the client or the patient in assisted outpatient treatment. And maybe others will talk about that. It's very interesting how Laura's Law works. Laura's Law has no real teeth to it. There is no real compulsion in Laura's Law. But Laura's Law does work. Laura's Law, as others have said, has been implemented or something similar to it in 44 states. It rests on the assumption that most people are law-abiding citizens, and when faced with a court order, will comply with that court order and stay engaged in treatment. And so it has been in Nevada County. Mayor Lee, I think, talked a little bit about the results in New York State, Kendra's Law. Laura's Law is modeled very closely after Kendra's Law, and the results in Nevada County have been very similar to what New York State has seen. Laura's Law was fully implemented in Nevada County in 2008. It wasn't implemented in Nevada County out of the kindness of our supervisor's heart, I have to admit. It was implemented as a result of a court settlement that we made with Nevada County. But since its implementation, there has been enormous buy-in by all factions in Nevada County. The results in Nevada County have been very encouraging, way beyond what we had anticipated. Of those referred to AOT, or assisted outpatient treatment, under Laura's Law, over 50% engage in treatment voluntarily. So the compulsory aspect of Laura's Law is not used more often than it is used, and that's an important thing to remember. So there's a collaborative process whereby clients meet with the judge and through an incremental process do engage in treatment, first a little bit, then more, and finally full treatment. In Nevada County, there's been documented a 64% decline in psychiatric hospital days. There's been a 27% decline in incarceration or days in prison. There's been a 33% decline in homeless days. There's been a 64% decline in emergency interventions. Overall, for every dollar spent on treatment under assisted outpatient treatment in Nevada County, there has been documented $1.81 of avoided costs. In Nevada County, Laura's Law clearly saves lives and it saves money. It is the compassionate thing to do, as Mayor Lee said. And I believe that if San Francisco implements Laura's Law, you will have the same experience as Nevada County. And thank you again to Supervisor Farrell and Mayor Lee. We really appreciate your support. This has been a very long struggle, but it's not all the time that you have two major counties in 1 week getting to this point. It's really significant, and we hope it will lead to a domino effect. Thank you very much.
Thank you to the Wilcox family, not only for coming down from Nevada County, but for sharing your story today. At this point, I would like to introduce our Director of our Public Health Department, Barbara Garcia.
Good morning, and I just wanted to acknowledge the Wilcox family and thank you for all your work in this area. The Department of Public Health has an incredible mental health system. We serve over 30,000 individuals. So over the last 5 years, as we've been discussing Laura's Law and understanding the political process that it had to go through, we developed and proactively developed a program for voluntary system in that the client can voluntarily come into the system. And then it does have a mandatory treatment part towards if they do not meet the criteria, if they do not meet their treatment plan. With Laura's Law, the more important thing of this is that on the front end, it really allows for the family and providers, and I want to acknowledge the providers who watch their patients fail and die because of their lack of compassionate treatment. And because they don't have the tool to be able to mandate them into a process. And the laws are important for the civil rights of our mental health clients. And through this process, you will find the advocacy piece of ensuring that people have their rights through this law, and I believe it will. It also will look at the fact that these individuals and the ability for families to acknowledge the fact, it is very difficult for families to acknowledge the fact that they have a mentally ill child. And it is even harder once an adult child is in a system for that family to engage in their treatment because we have individual rights and we also have protection of their information. And an adult does not have to share that with their families. So we do have barriers for the providers as well as the family members to seek access for care for their family members. We believe that treatment does work. People do better when they have treatment. We've watched individuals who are mentally ill in our system become very active and good citizens in our community. We do not want people here at the emergency department. We're here to look at a law that would help our department engage earlier into treatment. So if enacted, the department will immediately set up, and we have over a dozen years of experience in working with our court systems, the criminal court system. This will be a civil court system. And we have the ability, and we also have the structures to work with the court systems, as well as to immediately set up an outpatient program, an assisted treatment program. And we know how to do this, and we have providers to do this. And we also have the state support for funding to ensure that this happens. And I know that the city will also support any services that we'll need to do this. So I look forward to working with community, with the advocates, to ensure that we work through this process and that we try to bring this program to fruition to ensure that more people have access to the treatment and more family members and our providers have the ability to take care of their family members and their patients. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Director Garcia. At this time, I'd like to call up Dr. John Rouse, who is an associate professor in UCSF's psychiatry department, and who's an attending physician at SF General's psychiatric inpatient service, psychiatric emergency service, and citywide focused case management, and who also has 20 years of experience right here at SF General. Dr. Rouse.
Thank you, Supervisor. That's very kind. I wish it were only 20 years. It's more like 35. So as you heard from our director, Barbara Garcia, San Francisco's behavioral health system offers 30,000 San Franciscans every year full spectrum, mostly voluntary treatment, from prevention through crisis, with goals of wellness, recovery, and most of them do very well with that. This group includes, this 30,000 includes about 7,300 who visit psychiatric emergency every year. And largely within that group is the group that we call the severely and chronically mentally ill. These are mostly patients with forms of schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. Decades ago, these are people who would have been locked up in state hospital for months and years. However, since that time, thanks to improvements in treatment, reform of the commitment laws, and what we now call the doctrine of the least restrictive treatment, these patients are being treated in the community. The vast majority of them extremely successfully in our community outpatient treatments. Unfortunately, this approach leaves behind a small number of patients. Some of these consistently refuse outpatient treatment. Others of them may have repeatedly demonstrated success in outpatient treatment, often for several years at a time, but they're unable to stay in that treatment owing to a chronic lack of insight. They cannot recognize or remember that they have a chronic illness and that they need ongoing treatment in order to maintain themselves. Oftentimes, after a year or two of successful treatment, they'll suddenly decide they don't need treatment anymore, they're doing fine, they'll stop seeing their treatment team, they'll go off their medications, and will start to deteriorate. The next month or two usually sees frantic efforts by their treatment team, their families, and their friends to bring them back into the hospital, get them on treatment. And all too often, this only ends when they're brought in by the police on a 5150 or arrested for threatening or harming themselves or other people. At that point, they've not only caused harm, they've usually become homeless, and they typically require 2 to 3 weeks of acute treatment to restabilize. Now, this deficit in insight, as you've heard, it's not simply a character trait. It's not simply a political opinion. Such patients generally can recognize the need for treatment in other people, just not in themselves. It is not a deficit of intelligence or knowledge. I will say we've treated several severely chronically mentally ill patients who had advanced degrees in neuroscience, including 1 or 2 psychiatrists, and they didn't see a need to take medications any more than anybody else. This reflects a problem called anosognosia, which is just Greek for no knowledge of disease. It really reflects an inability to understand a deficit or a disease process. It is commonly seen after many kinds of strokes. Patients will have a paralyzed arm and not realize that they're missing anything. And it's certainly seen in dementia and other forms of brain disease like schizophrenia. It's thought to represent deterioration or a trauma to the frontal and parietal lobes. But for our purposes, the important thing is that once we recognize that this chronic inability to develop and maintain insight is an integral part of the disease, then we can structure interventions to mitigate the damage from it. Laura's Law, as you've heard, assistant outpatient treatment, is designed for 2 interventions that will do that. Number 1, it provides external support and motivation to the patient's somewhat fragile internal sense of motivation. This is called the black robe effect. When a judge sitting up on the bench says, you really should do this, most people will heed and remember that. It will make an impression that they can stick with. And they, as you've heard, they follow up much better. The second is that if that motivation fails, there is a backstop. And Laura's Law will enable the treatment team, the family, and the friends to intervene early and effectively if the patient drops out of treatment and starts to deteriorate. Now, if it's caught quickly, this kind of deterioration can often be reversed in 24 hours in the psychiatric emergency service, and an inpatient admissions may be avoided altogether, and I've had that happen to numerous people. The number of patients in San Francisco who would qualify for Laura's Law is relatively small. We're estimating no more than about 100. However, they are often extremely high users of ambulance services, crisis services, and inpatient services. They are frequently incarcerated, and they are repeatedly and serially homeless. With Laura's Law in place, we would hope to see a reduction in those PES visits, the acute hospitalizations, and the arrests if we have interventions available for people with severe mental illness who are deteriorating and not seeking treatment. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Doctor. And lastly, want to call up Randall Hagar, who is the VP of the California Psychiatric Association, and as Wilcox has mentioned, has been integral in the passage of this legislation at the state level, and an incredible source of support. Thank you very much.
Hi, I am Randall Hager. I represent psychiatrists around the state, about 3,500 of them. It's obvious from Dr. Rouse's testimony that psychiatrists often have to deal with people who are at the end of a long arc of neglect, and they are very, very sick because of that neglect. And psychiatrists around the state staff the emergency departments, they staff the psychiatric emergency service departments, they are the psychiatrists on the inpatient psychiatric units, they are the psychiatrists in state hospitals, and they're the psychiatrists in state prisons. And because of those positions, psychiatrists know as well as anyone what happens when you neglect people. People often end up in these institutions, and they're very, very difficult to treat at that late stage in their, if you will, career. If you look at those individuals and you trace back the story of any particular one, you will find missed opportunities in the community to intervene in these lives. Or you will find many opportunities that were not sufficiently adequate or effective. And because of those missed opportunities, these individuals end up very, very sick, and it is a problem that San Francisco knows well. I will give you a personal anecdote by way of explaining how I became involved in this. I not only represent psychiatrists, but as a NAMI California board member, 15 years ago, I got involved in the drafting of Laura's Law because my own son with a psychotic disorder proved to me what I thought was an effective combination of elements. One is the structure of a court or a legal system helping treatment officials gain compliance in treatment. And the other, of course, is effective intensive services. My son was diagnosed before he was 16. He was the most stable for about 10 years during the period when he was when he was diagnosed and his 18th birthday. And I have a story similar to the one that Supervisor Farrell told, in which he, because weekly a probation officer would come and ask 4 questions, he would ask my son, while I'm standing there, are you obeying your father? Are you seeing your psychiatrist? Are you seeing your therapist? And are you taking your meds? That weekly contact, even though we had very, very good services, that weekly contact was a difference for my son. As soon as he turned 18, no longer under the jurisdiction of the court, he took off for 9 months, and he was arrested in 3 different counties and jailed 4 or 5 different times. He was in inpatient units between Marin County, Eureka, and Sacramento, and he had a very rough time of it because he was living on the street. So I know personally, and I know from the stories of families, how necessary it is to have an effective tool. And that's why psychiatrists in this state very, very much appreciate the mayor and the supervisors for taking the steps forward to change the lives permanently of some people with mental illness who are too difficult to treat with the other tools, albeit as good as they might be. This specialized tool of Laura's Law can be very, very effective for those people and stop a lot of very, very unfortunate outcomes. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hagar. I want to thank again everyone for being here in attendance today, in particular the Wilcox family. And let's remember, when we talk about Laura's Law, this is about helping individuals And this is the most compassionate, community-driven process that we have available for us here in San Francisco. I look forward to shepherding it through the Board of Supervisors inside of City Hall. And if we can't get through the board, taking it to the voters this November so we can fully implement Laura's Law here in San Francisco. Thanks, everyone.